Oftentimes, I use the term crucial truth, and I actually have a specific definition in my mind when I use the term, and it's truth that is especially important for the betterment of society and of our personal lives. And these crucial truths I find are, for the most part, sidelined, marginalized, censored, ignored. Even when said directly to someone, they oftentimes don't get a um, warm welcome, so to speak. They may just sound unimportant and bland, but they're extremely important and should actually bring some excitement in knowing that they do actually have the potency to bring positive change because they are getting at the root of the problem. So, a crucial truth, big picture, is bunk morality rules the world. And there's a silver lining to this, as I've mentioned before, which is that the reason why we have to be indoctrinated with and propagandized with, brainwashed with a bunk morality is because that's not our natural conscience. Our natural conscience is actually aligned with love, aligned with true morality, aligned with God's law. We were made in the imagination of a good creator and in his likeness. So the fact that we need to be deceived is actually something that can be looked at as a silver lining, something that can make you hopeful because it shows that we're not just inherently depraved as the false Paulinist Christian dogma tells billions of people for centuries now. Of course, it's not just limited to Paulinist Christianity. There's other folks like some atheists and Satanists who would agree with that perspective. But it's not true because if it was true, then we wouldn't need to be propagandized so much, right? We wouldn't need these alphabet agencies constantly playing psi warfare games, right? We wouldn't need indoctrination. We wouldn't need false religion. People would just naturally assimilate to the system. They wouldn't need to be deceived into thinking it's good, right? So, with that as a sort of introduction, a couple things that came back around to my attention as examples of false morality, which are huge examples. Okay, in the news just recently, this is the end of January 2024, the United States government, I guess the federal government, is criminalizing hate speech towards themselves, which, by the way, I called out. I said that was most certainly going to be the follow-up. They get the wedge in the door with criminalizing hate speech against people that are minorities in whatever fashion, in society, or and who have, some of who have indeed faced persecution. So they'll say, oh, well, that's bad. And so what we're going to do is criminalize speech against them. And people go along with it because they think, oh, yeah, that sounds like a good thing. That sounds like progress. But they don't realize it's just Marxism, which is always intent on just giving the state more power. They don't actually care about you. They don't actually care about these minorities. They don't really care about anyone but themselves. And hate speech laws, all that does is increase the power of the government, increase the power of the state to a large degree, right? They now can regulate your speech, right? That's why the First Amendment is so important, because when you don't have free speech, you're basically living under despotism, under totalitarianism. So it started with hate speech being bad against um, minority groups. And, there was like just a recent case where they actually charged someone with the crime of, they either charged someone with the crime or said they're going to start charging them with the crime of basically having negative speech towards any official, and then that would be deemed hate speech, right? So there's classic, communism for you. There's Marxism for you, and then related is what they call a hate crime. So they also just recently said that this guy, he's a Christian veteran who destroyed this satanic statue that was in a public place. They're now saying that's a hate crime, right? So um, when you give the state these powers initially, because it seems like what they're using the power for initially is somewhat legit, like it seems like, oh, they're actually being virtuous for a change. Like, think again, it's just, like I said, a wedge in the door to be followed up by expanding the definition of, expanding the list of who you can't say anything bad about. And so how does this relate to bunk morality? Well, it's because it's designating hatred as immoral, when in fact it's not. So just to cut to the conclusion, or jump to the conclusion real quick to help make this more clear as I continue, the moral good is loving action, loving speech, loving thought, loving action. Love in the sense of befriending action. It's like you're treating someone as your friend, that kind of love. Of course, it can be more intense than just friendly, but that's the core essence of it. It's when you express love towards someone, it's a befriending kindness, a loving kindness that's befriending the other person or animal, right? And the complete opposite of that is abuse. Being abusive towards a person or abusive towards an animal, that's pure evil. It's the complete opposite of love. It's the polar opposite. So that's what real morality is, which should be common knowledge, but it's not. If you ask most people, like, what's the moral good and what's the moral bad, you're going to get a whole bunch of different answers. And some of those answers might include, love is good, but they'll say hate is the opposite. And they're actually mixing up the two different forms of love, or two different, I should say, words with separate definitions, right? The noun and the verb. The verb is, as I was describing, befriending, loving kindness. But then just to love something, like, oh, I love that meal, or I love the scent of the rose, right? Or you walk by a fish market and you say, oh, I hate that smell, it's disgusting. If you don't like the smell of dead fish and you say, oh, I hate that, did you just do something immoral? No, of course not. It's just, I'm biting my tongue. It's unintelligent to think extreme dislike is immoral, right? So for someone to have hatred for something or even someone is not inherently immoral, right? And so what's the point of these laws, right? They're supposed to be legislating morality, right? I mean, that's the whole idea behind their legitimacy, is that they're increasing the good in the world and decreasing the bad, right? There are wonderful parental overlords making the world a better place. So if the idea behind these hate speech laws and hate crimes is that they're making the world a better place because they're attacking anyone expressing hatred, well, that's a bunk morality. And that's how they are then able to use that false morality to further immorality, because it was never aligned with true morality in the first place. I'm not saying it's wonderful when someone expresses hatred towards you, but, and I'm not encouraging, you know, people to verbalize or, you know, express hatred towards other people, um, you know, just willy-nilly, or, you know, as a, as a, I don't know, hobby or whatever. But what I am saying is it's not technically immoral, right? And so this matters because if you're letting the government continue down this path towards so-called social justice, and the foundation of it is a false morality, well, guess what? It's just going to make the world worse. So you hear the word hate, and you know, you maybe you kind of cringe, or you kind of cower internally, like, oh, hate, that's bad. But when you realize, like, the definition of the word is extreme dislike, does it make sense to criminalize having extreme dislike? No. What does it make sense to criminalize? Abuse. But that can actually be carried out by a state, because the state's power is attained through abuse. So they're hypocrites and are not in a position to legislate morality when their whole existence and their paychecks in particular come from immoral action, namely extortion. And then, of course, there's all the abuses on top of that, like criminalizing people that haven't actually done anything wrong, imprisoning people, you know, political prisoners, you know, torture, state-sponsored terrorism, you know, allowing all kinds of toxins and radiation to flourish, and on, invading people's privacy on the regular, you know, for our safety, right? Actually, invading someone's privacy is an act of aggression. It's an initiation of violence against someone, and that's a form of abuse. So if you're being abused, you're not safer. So all of this abuse in the name of safety is just complete BS. Okay, another big example that I saw come back around in the press is appeal to the majority. You know, you'll have, especially on the left, you know, like more socialist minded, when they don't get something through that they want, which inevitably gives the state more power, they might oftentimes say, you'll oftentimes hear them say something like, oh, they're going against the will of the majority, or the will of the people. And if you don't have that diamond cut clear perception of morality, I don't know if I said that very well, but you get the idea, that what's the true moral good is love, and the true moral evil is abuse. When you hear them talking about the will of the people, majority, as if that's a moral cause, or as if that's like the determining factor as to whether something's good or not, like, oh, is the majority for it? Well, then it's good. So let's just briefly, let me just briefly explain why that's bunk morality if you don't already understand why. So number one, it's actually a logical fallacy, appeal to popularity, that just because something is believed true or good by a majority of people, it is therefore true, right? That has not been the case countless times, and there's no reason to think it would be the case. It's just an assumption. It's just an irrational thought process. It's not sound judgment. You're just saying, oh, well, here's 10 people, and, um, you know, if 6 of them think this, then the four must be wrong. Like that's just stupid. It's a logical fallacy. But there's other problems with it besides it just being bad reasoning or stupid thinking, just irrational thinking, is that they can manipulate the situation. They can manipulate statistics and elections so that who they're saying or what they're saying is actually the will of the majority may not actually be the will of the majority. But most importantly to understand is, well, it doesn't really matter whether it's the will of the majority or not, because that's not the determining factor of whether something is ethical or not. What is the determining factor? Well, you may have heard of Jesus Christ. He was the Messiah, if you didn't know. He is the Messiah, Savior of humanity, giving us God's word and law. And so he actually, as you should not be surprised if you are open to the possibility of him actually being the Messiah, he actually gave us the perfect moral law. He called it the greatest commandments, which is to love God, others, and yourself with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's comprehensive love. Who can you be loving towards in reality? You can be loving towards others, other people, animals, other sentient beings. You can be loving towards yourself, and you can be loving towards God. And so he included all three actors, you could say, in your reality, all three categories of being that you can be loving towards. And he said you want to maximize love towards all three all the time. And if you do all three all the time in balance, you're on the right track. Right? He didn't say, oh, well, what does the majority think? I mean, if you just look at the life, of Jesus, obviously, the majority around him was wrong, right? They were all shouting for his crucifixion. But there's just endless examples. And again, you don't even need to point to an example. You can just think about it logically, right? Or there's even, like the cartoon example of you have, 6 wolves deciding, 6 wolves and 4 sheep, and, the majority gets to decide what's for dinner kind of thing. Just because the majority thinks it's true, doesn't necessarily mean it's true. That's not what we should be looking at as a moral compass. So when you read in a news article that they're talking about, oh, they're, some Democrat or socialist or whoever, or Republican, anybody, it doesn't matter who it is. If they're saying, this is against the will of the people, or this is against the majority, that's not the right foundation for an argument. If you're talking about good and bad, morally good or bad, that's not the right foundation. The foundation is love is good, abuse is bad, right? So the question is this abusive or is it loving? If you can point to it being abusive, well, then you can say, well, this is bad because it's abusive, because either it's aggressive, or because they're stealing from someone, or because they're deceiving from someone, right? Those are the 3 forms of abuse. That would be a sound moral argument, right? But if you're just saying, oh, the majority, or oh, let's hate, see, it's disconnected from the true moral law given to us by the Messiah. Or if you don't want to think of it in relation to the Messiah for whatever reason, it still holds as just the intelligent moral perspective. As I've explained, hatred doesn't hold up as being the moral evil, and neither does something being unpopular hold up as being a moral evil. but abuse does. The end. That's it. That's a crucial truth. It'd be great if the majority of people would get that, understand that, and talk about it rather than following all this bunk morality. It's almost like, let's use an illustration. Like imagine a tree. Let's call it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And imagine this tree had fruit, right? And the fruit was that knowledge, right? So when you ate the fruit, you gained the knowledge of good and evil. And now let's imagine a serpent was on that tree, and he contaminated the fruit so that the knowledge of good and evil was corrupted. We could call that bunk morality. And guess what happens when humans ingest that bad fruit? They lose paradise, and they become tools, victims, slaves of Satan's system. And to address a couple of objections I'm sure some people would jump to right away, a lot of people would probably say, well, this doesn't make any sense. He's saying abuse is evil, but then he's saying hate speech is okay, but hate speech is abusive. Well, it's not. To just get right to the conclusion here, but I'll explain. Slander. Let's talk about what kind of speech that is actually abusive. That would be slander, for example, like accusing somebody of being evil or irrational or having done something wrong when they haven't actually done anything wrong. That is actually abusive speech. Just saying, I don't like that person, or I don't like what they're doing to an extreme degree. I really, really don't like it, right? And guess what? Really, really, really not liking something it's hating something. So if you really, really, really don't like someone, you can also say, I hate them. It's the same thing. Right? You can, I think it's fair to say kind of casual definition of hate. It's like if a child were to ask you, what does it mean to hate someone? A parent would probably say something like, well, it's when you really, really, really don't like something. It's a fair definition. It's an accurate definition. Maybe not, very academic sounding, but accurate nonetheless. So if you're just saying, I really, really don't like this guy, or I really, really don't like this woman, or I really, really don't like that animal over there, I hate them, right? So you're speaking hatred, hate speech. That's not actually abuse. That speech is not abusive towards the other person. You have a right to like and dislike whatever and whoever. That comes with the freedom package. In case you were wondering what freedom was all about, well, it includes stuff like that, like the ability to like and dislike things without being persecuted for your likes or dislikes. Goodness. I feel like I'm, giving a talk at a North Korean classroom or something, but here I am in the land of the free. So hate speech in and of itself is not abusive, but yes, there is such thing as abusive speech. Of course, abuse is not just like physical contact, like physically hitting someone. You can be verbally abusive. However, what does it mean to criminalize that? It means the state can put you in a cage, right? And if you resist being put in the cage, the state can kill you. Okay? So, getting back to the true moral law, an important thing to understand is how defensive force fits in. It's not complicated, but because the satanic system never educates people on it. Instead, gives us the bunk morality. This common sense is lacking. So if someone is being aggressive, someone is being abusive, it doesn't violate the moral law to use proportional defensive force. You may have heard, like, even in sports, they'll talk about like excessive force, right? Being a violation, right? It's like, if someone slaps you on the arm or something, and you then, shoot them with a bow and arrow or whatever, that wouldn't be legit. That's not okay. Because why? Because it's excessive, right? It's not proportional to the abuse that was committed. Pretty straightforward, right? So, returning to the scenario of criminalizing speech, the problem with that is that the punishment is not proportional, right? Because what would be proportional? It would be using speech back, right? And of course, if they persist and won't desist, it can reach a point where some physical defensive force could be appropriate. If it's like someone's standing 2 inches from you and shouting in your face and you tell them to stop and leave and they refuse to stop and leave, like eventually it's okay to physically, move them away from you if, say, it's, on your own property, right? But again, it's reasonable, it's proportional. But saying the state has the right to, put you in a cage and kill you if you resist because you expressed hatred for someone, well, it's just doubly wrong. Because again, if you're just solely expressing hatred, extreme dislike, that's not even abuse in the first place. So there's no appropriate defensive force for that because it's not actually a violation of the moral law to begin with. So if you're committing so-called defense against someone expressing hatred, that's just false. That's it's not truly an act of justice being carried out because they didn't actually do anything wrong to begin with. Not saying it's necessarily pleasant. Again, that's part of what comes with freedom. Sometimes people are going to say things they don't like. Sometimes people are maybe not going to like you and for no good reason. But just because someone does that doesn't mean that you then have the right to, fine them money and if they don't pay and kidnap them and throw them in a cage. And if they resist, kill them, It's not legit. And it's just, to me, this is just so common sense. I don't know why. I mean, I do know why. It's appeal to authority, appeal to popularity. It's the brainwashing, it's the propaganda. But oftentimes I'll just return to thinking of living on an island. Like I oftentimes use this example, like this thought experiment, because it just clarifies everything so quickly. If you're on a trip and the boat got lost and ended up on an uninhabited island, and you all were stuck there for you don't know how long, and you had to gather food and water and get along, what would be the basic rule? It would be, well, nobody be violent to anybody else, nobody deceive anybody else, no one steal from anybody else, right? And someone says something you don't like and you then tie them to a tree or something, like some excessive response. It's not legit. People say, hey, what are you doing? You can't tie the guy to the tree just because he said something. He said that he didn't like whatever, meal you made, or they said he didn't like you, or it's clearly excessive, right? It's not real defensive force, right? Because the moment defensive force becomes excessive, it's no longer defensive force, it's then abusive. And you can't do evil to combat evil. It's not legitimate. You can use defensive force, which is good, because it's an act of love towards whoever you're defending, which can be yourself or others. All right, if a parent defends their child who's being attacked, that's an act of love. If someone just attacks you and you defend yourself, you're loving yourself. Very straightforward. So I hope that helped clarify that the objections to what I'm saying are not sound. You're not thinking it through completely. And the true moral of love, and we could also call that the non-abuse principle, is really the morality that we all need to get behind and demand as the only legit moral compass. And so when they're presenting you with all these false moral perspectives, you can say, no, that's not abuse, or what you're talking about isn't love. If it's not one or the other, it's not. You're not really talking about real morality. This is just propaganda. This is just BS. So that's the way to disentangle from the bunk morality that has led us out of paradise and get us back to real social justice. And returning to the island, just to add another crucial truth, I talked about you would share the food and water, right? That would be the common sense thing to do. And why? Because it was pre-existing in nature, right? There's coconuts on the tree, there's some fresh water in a little pond. You need that for survival. It makes sense to share it among the survivors, right? Evenly, not have one or two people control it all and make the other people work for it, right? So it's actually the same scenario here on Earth when you're born on the planet. These natural resources we need for survival, namely land and water and plants, seed, a fair share of that, namely, again, to be super specific, which almost nobody ever is, so nothing changes, homestead scale, land, water, and seed for everybody should be considered a birthright. Why? Because it's abusive not to recognize it as a birthright. Why? Because if you were on an island and you didn't share the land and water and seed, that'd be abusive. So what's the difference between the island and the planet on an ethical level? Zero. Nothing. Just a bunch of political theater and bullshit. Nothing really there. It's all illusion. The ethics is exactly the same. So yeah, sovereign veganic homesteads should be a birthright for everybody. Forming voluntary communities, that would be the right foundation for society based on the non-abuse principle. Also, the greatest commandments of Yeshua the Messiah. Like I said, it's the same principle. Comprehensive love, being for comprehensive love is the same as being against all abuse, because they're opposites. That's just basic logic there. All right, thanks for listening.